And the next speaker is going to be telling us exactly that. Because Gregory Galant is not only he's the CEO and co-founder of Muck Rack, which has a phenomenally high network of journalists around. So to talk to us about how can we build trust with journalists, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Greg Galant.
So I'm the co-founder and CEO of both Muck Rack and the Shorty Awards. Muck Rack's a platform to find journalists to pitch on story ideas, monitor the news, build reports. The Shorty Awards is the largest award for best of social media. And we work with, we're really lucky to work with lots of great clients, both brands and agencies, many of the ones in this room. But talking to people here reminded me that Muck Rack is a play on a uniquely American term. So I figured I should explain what the name means, and that's probably a great launching point to talk about the relationship between PR and journalists and trust in news. So it comes from the term muck raker, and these are the original muck rakers here. Julius, Nellie, they were journalists. The term muck raker refers to journalists in the early 1900s who were doing investigative work. Julius went undercover as a patient in a hospital to show how they weren't treating their patients well, and Nellie checked herself in undercover to an insane asylum to show how they were mistreating the patients in the insane asylum. So doing pretty brave work. But where did the term muckraker actually come from? So this is the speech where it was coined from. You may recall the description of the man with the muck rake. Goes on and on, continued to rake himself to the filth of the floor. And what's going to piss off journalists the most is if someone they cover comes up with a term for them. And sure enough, it was Teddy Roosevelt who gave this speech. But he goes on and says overall he's positive. He actually had a pretty good relationship with the press. Says he calls him a benefactor, even when they make attacks with merciless severity. And if you're in PR, you should know what it's like when a journalist makes an attack on what you're doing with merciless severity. But he was good with it so long as it was truthful. And as time went on, journalists initially didn't really like the term, as you might imagine, back in the 20s. But as time went on in America, it became a very real compliment to call a journalist a muckraker, because it means they're actually doing investigative work and they're actually kind of finding stories themselves, not just regurgitating what's told to them. And that's what's made us proud to use this name. And as a company, we always put journalists first, and with that, I'll be talking about just kind of some differences between the Indian market and other markets like the US. Then I'll show some of our original research on how journalists like to both use social media, and then finally how they like to interact with PR and be pitched themselves. So first, in looking at this, we see, compared to other countries, more people in India are getting their news through Twitter and Facebook as opposed to other online sources like going to a media website. And I'd speculate this is because if you're coming online for the first time now, getting your first cell phone, we're already in an era where social networks are dominant, so it makes sense that you'd be trained to use the social networks first and access news that way, versus when we were getting online, and, those of us who've been online for a while and who are online pre-social media would have already developed habits going to media outlet websites and getting news in a number of other ways. Interestingly, though, I was surprised the French are beating us Americans at using Twitter, so you never know. This isn't too surprising, but of all the social platforms, Facebook's the most popular, and above all the messaging platforms, WhatsApp is the most popular, And this is specifically for how people are getting their news. And Twitter's actually got a pretty good chunk of it. So of course, Facebook is much, much bigger than Twitter. But for people getting their news here in India, it's 18% through Twitter, whereas just about half through Facebook. And then a good number through Instagram, too. And this was interesting to look at what they look at when they decide what news to click on. And I think this is something that could be a bit troubling, too. And I suspect it's the same across most countries, is that the biggest thing people are looking for is the headline or the picture. And that can be troublesome because, of course, something could have a great headline, a great picture, but be from a really unreliable source. Although, closely trailing that, you can see people look at brand and who shares it. So it is heartening to see that people are taking these other factors into account, too. And there are a number of ways that people are sharing news on the two most prevalent platforms, Facebook and WhatsApp, which of course are both owned by Facebook. The biggest thing is just looking at news headlines and clicking on them. But a good number also discuss the stories on these platforms, comment on them. So it's something to think about when you hear that news is being found through social networks. It's not just being found on the social networks, but it's also being discussed and editorialized too. Interestingly, the newspapers still have a wider reach offline than online. Probably not a surprise to most of you, but it's interesting from a perspective where in the US things have gone so far digital that the reaches of most newspapers are now much bigger online than in print. I think that's a trend that we'll see play out in many other parts of the world in the next few years. And this is a question about people's concern on fake news, and people associate it most with facts that are spun or twisted for an agenda and poor journalism. And then there's a lesser group of people who responded where they're kind of associated with the term used to discredit news media. So it's something to think about as a challenge, and I think this is kind of the twofold challenge of fake news. One is that there is an inaccurate information out there that can be justly categorized as fake news, but then it's become a convenient tool for politicians, and as we were talking, some of the earlier panels mentioned, potentially corporations too, to be able to write off true news. So it's something I think everyone's kind of coming to grapple with now. And on that note, about 2/3 of people felt that publishers and platforms should do more to address the disinformation problem. And that's true, that's about consistent that publishers should do more and platforms should do more across both America and India. But I think one interesting distinction is that here in India, about 60%, 65% of the people want the government to step in and do more to fight disinformation, whereas in the US, only 41% want the government to get involved with that. And I suspect it's due to, in the US, there's always been such a kind of separation between the people kind of distrusting the government to regulate the press. So now we're going to dive into the survey results that we do. Every year we survey journalists and kind of look at their behavior, preferences in terms of how they like to be pitched. And to me, this is always a fascinating stat to look at, whereas I showed you Facebook dominates social media, dominates how regular people find news. But journalists love Twitter. So the way journalists are getting their news, mostly it's from online newspapers and magazines. That's 59% say they do. But then 22% get it through Twitter. So the number two thing outside of going to the newspaper websites themselves is going on Twitter. And then that still, even just Twitter dominates looking at print newspapers. It dominates all other social platforms, dominates radio broadcast. And poor Facebook only has 2% in this question. So it's something I really challenge people in PR to think about, which is even if you don't think Twitter is essential to reaching your end audience, it's very important for reaching journalists. On that note, when we just asked journalists about which social networks are most valuable to them, 83% said Twitter, 40% say Facebook. Facebook's still a big deal. LinkedIn only gets 26%, and this is fascinating because in most professions, people would say they use LinkedIn as their most valuable network to do their job, and then maybe Facebook after, and they just use Twitter to check sports scores and argue about politics. But with journalists, it's a very unique use case. This shows the trends of where they're looking to spend more or less time. So the green means they want to spend more time on the platform. Red means they want to spend less. So you can see journalists are planning on spending even more time on Twitter, which might or might not be healthy, but that's what they're doing. They're looking to spend more time on Twitter. They're looking to spend less time on Facebook. They're looking to spend more time on LinkedIn, which I think is interesting. We see journalists say I think they adopted LinkedIn in a different way than most people because LinkedIn wasn't as useful for them as their resume, because the journalist's resume is more all the articles they've written, but it can be great to find sources. And also, LinkedIn now has its own news feed that you can use to drive traffic to your articles. So I suspect that's why journalists are getting more interested in LinkedIn now. They're also looking to spend more time on Instagram, so you shouldn't feel too bad for Mark Zuckerberg. And then they're looking to spend more time on Reddit also and YouTube. So, in general, there are platforms where it's trending up for journalists. We know journalists care a lot about how many times their stories get shared after it's published. It's a really important metric to pay attention to and something you can track in Muck Rack. And so we want to know from the journalists what makes a story more shareable? What do they view as making a story as something that will get shared a lot on social media? The first thing is that the story contains an image, which makes a lot of sense because when you post that story to social, it always shows a little thumbnail, and it's really changed the internet. Just 5 or 10 years ago, many articles went online without any photos. Now just about everything does. So if you're putting news out there, I really challenge you all to invest more in creating great imagery to go with it, maybe infographics or hiring a photographer to take a really, really great photo to go along with your story. But the journalists are now thinking about how do we package in the images with this so it can live and get distributed online. The next biggest is that the subject can be connected to a trending story. Some people call this idea newsjacking. Basically, it means rather than pitching and avoid and just saying, hey, we have this news we want to get out, it's thinking about what's a big story happening today. Journalists are going to want to write about this story. Can my client's news connect to this story in any way? Now, how do you actually build better relationships with journalists? How do you pitch them in a way that they'll appreciate and not be annoyed by? First of all, we found most journalists prefer one-to-one emails. So they want to know that they're getting an email from you, that it's meant just for them, and that's the pitch. They really don't like mass emails. They started to really hate phone calls, and many younger journalists don't even have phones anymore. And most of them also, and I'm going to talk more about Twitter in a moment, most of them don't actually like being pitched by Twitter. Only 13% do. Even though they love using Twitter, I find those that like to be pitched on Twitter will often say in their Twitter bio, DM me with story ideas, etc. And there are some exceptions to this. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then they don't like other social networks. So email is really the way to go by and large with how you make your pitches. In terms of time of day, this is really bad news for anyone who's not a morning person like myself. But journalists like to be pitched in the morning. In the morning, they're figuring out what to write about. They're kind of fresh. They're getting their ideas. And by the afternoon, they're just trying to meet their deadline. So pitch in the morning. Again, with that idea with one-to-one emails, the biggest reason journalists reject pitches is the email they get with the pitch isn't personalized. So make sure you're personalizing your pitches, you're referencing other articles, you're saying something personal about them, connecting with them in one way or another. Bad timing, like I just said, is another big one. And then I'll talk about some of these other factors soon too. This is kind of, I think, counter to a lot of how many of us were trained in PR, where a lot of us learned the 5 W's, and the idea was you write your press release and you answer the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and why. And a lot of people took that and thought, okay, well, I have to email the journalist and answer every question, and in my initial pitch, answer the 5 W's, give them the whole picture, and then if they want, they'll write the story based on it. But in reality, the pitch email, it's really just a way to get someone interested. It's like a first date. You don't have to propose marriage right there and tell the person everything about you. You just want to get them interested in knowing more. Journalists love asking questions. So when you're emailing a journalist, make sure that you're figuring out, like, what's a good hook, what's going to get them interested, how do you just tell them really succinctly why what you're pitching them on is a great story idea, why it matters for their audience. It's their job to ask the questions. So once they're interested, they'll ask you all those questions and flesh it out, and I'm sure by the end of it you'll have written 500 words, 1,000 words. But keep that initial email really short. And I'm sure it's never happened to anybody in this room, but I've had some PR people tell me that they've emailed journalists and the journalists haven't responded to their email. So if you have any friends who that's ever happened to, you can let them know that most journalists are actually okay with one follow-up. 73% are okay with one follow-up, 11% are okay with more than one follow-up, and only 12% are just flat out don't want follow-ups. So what does that mean? If you sent them an email the first time, there's a good chance that they were just busy that day, maybe they were under deadline with another story, maybe they had the day off, and they missed the email. So it doesn't hurt just to send a follow-up note after your first email, and just, hey, checking if you got my last email, maybe reference something else that's developed about the story, and see if they write about it. Going back to Twitter, I find if I have a good relationship with the journalist, sometimes what I'll do is I'll never pitch them over Twitter, but I'll send them a DM just saying, hey, I sent you an email last week, did you get it? And a lot of times they'll then dig it up in their inbox and reply to me by email or DM me back. Of course, one nuance of that is that you can only DM somebody on Twitter, direct message someone on Twitter, if they follow you or if they've turned on a special setting that lets anyone direct message them, which isn't the default. So that's where it really pays to have built a relationship with the journalist already, because they follow you, you can definitely direct message them. And whatever you do, whenever I say something about Twitter, don't publicly @reply them, because then everyone else sees you're pitching them on a story, and all the other journalists you know will be offended that you're not giving them the story. And speaking of journalists being offended if they don't get the story, journalists love exclusives when they're offered exclusives as opposed to just being told about something after it's published. This is something you really have to think about when you roll out news now, is that if you just put out the news on your blog in a press release and then you pitch journalists, it's really hard, because increasingly the journalists know if you've put it on the web, all their readers have access to that. So if you're not offering them something of unique value before it goes live, your life becomes more difficult, unless you're Apple or you just have huge leverage in the press. But everybody else has to really think, how do you give something to journalists that their readers can't get otherwise? In terms of who the journalists think of as most credible, academic subject matter experts they view as their most credible. Good news for people like myself, CEOs are the second most credible sources in the eyes of journalists. Company PR professionals, 58% of journalists view as most credible. And I'm sorry to all the agency folks here, but they say only 37% of journalists find agency PR professionals most credible. But if you are with an agency, you can take heart in knowing that you're viewed as more credible than bloggers. social media personalities, celebrities, and self-appointed subject matter experts. Another nuance to Twitter and social media, most journalists like it when you follow them on social, particularly Twitter, also Instagram and other platforms. Why is that? It's because the number of followers they have on these social platforms can really affect their next raise, their next promotion, the next job offer they get. So make sure you're following these journalists on social, ideally a good bit of time before you pitch them. And I think it's great to think of Twitter and these other social platforms like a cocktail party. If you meet a journalist out at a cocktail party, you probably don't want to pitch them right there on your story idea, but you want to get to know them. You'd introduce yourself, you'd say your name, talk about your family, ask them what they're doing this weekend. Twitter's a great place for that. You can build a rapport with journalists on Twitter, get them to know your name, and then by the time you email them, they know who you are, and they're going to be more likely to respond. So I think it really pays for PR professionals to invest in your social media presence and then build strong relationships with journalists on social media so you can then pitch them by email, but have the relationship already built beforehand. And on that note of your social media, I think it's important for you to have your own social media profiles in a strong way, but journalists are actually looking at companies' social media profiles before writing about the company. So think of you on coverage, what's your social media department doing? Because the journalist is going to look at that and judge you on it. I also just read this stat that one of my employees posted to our company's Slack saying that many job applicants are now looking at the CEO's social media profiles before accepting the job offer. So I now feel a lot more personal pressure to make sure that I'm tweeting out good stuff. But again, it's something that you have to think about, that the social media you do connects to all the traditional press that you get because the journalists are using social media to do their job. Just to sum up, make sure you're pitching journalists by one-on-one emails in the morning, ideally between 9 and 11 a.m. Keep it short, 2 to 3 paragraphs. Do your research before you pitch. Check out the credibility of the journalists and the outlets before you pitch them. And after you pitch them, make sure that you share your articles and you do everything you can to make the articles shareable. If you want a copy of this deck, you can find it at this URL. And with that, really appreciate you all giving me this time, and happy to take questions if there's time for it.
Thank you. I think that was very nice for you to offer the presentation, Greg. Very good. You're also the founder of Shorty Awards. What is that?
Sure. So the Shorty Awards are the largest global award show honoring the best of social media, both what social media influencers are doing, celebrities are doing on social media, and brands are doing on social media. It's an annual award show that takes place in New York.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Greg.
Thank you.